Hi, I'm Aidan Weller. Welcome back to my podcast. It's about days of my life. In 1985, I was 4 years old. My life was like a film, with me, the central starring character. My mum and dad, my siblings, they were characters in my film. Then, seemingly for no reason, the producers of the film decided that they'd change the script. They gave the actors new lines, gave my mum and dad a new storyline, called Divorce. Everything changed from that point onwards. As long as your mum and dad are together, the narrative of your life is, we're a family. Whatever happens, it will happen to the family. And when your parents get divorced, all of a sudden, there's no narrative. I think it forces you to start looking at your parents, not as everlasting strongholds, a solid unit and a partnership. You have to imagine a new future. As a child, this can be really difficult. You have to start imagining many possibilities. What if my dad meets someone else? What if my mum meets someone else? Where do I belong in their future? Where do they belong in my future? I started to see them as dynamic people in their own rights. You saw that they actually had to make things happen for themselves. You become aware that someone's responsible for looking after them as well. Who gets mum up in the morning? Who validates dad when he gets home from work? To begin with, it was pretty harsh. My dad went into deep depression, and my mum just ploughed on through it with stress, work and worry. They weren't happy together. Ultimately, that was having a bad effect on us as children. Despite how desperately I didn't want our family to fracture and break up, I can see now that I've grown up that it was the only sensible thing that they could do. It's not the end of the world, it's the end of a world. So as the sun sets, the sun will rise again. Best thing about being a parent is you get to be somebody's role model. And even though a divorce can be a really sucky time for you, it's the best time to become a role model for your children. When a divorce happens, children feel all amounts of guilt, loss and grief. And that's your opportunity as a parent to say, yeah, sometimes in life we lose things. Sometimes our hearts become broken. But we can mend these things. We can heal these hearts. I'm going to end today's podcast by telling you some of the things that I loved about my parents despite their divorce. My mum taking me on an adventure ride at a theme park. It was called a log fling. You go down big steep hills and you get splashed by water. At one point on the ride, after we'd been down the first big hill and the big splash, I was having so much fun. It was exciting. I turned around to look at my mum and she was crying. She was scared. And not just scared, she started to ask to stop the ride. I remember at that point feeling so responsible for my mum's feelings and realising that she was actually just a human being. She couldn't protect me, she couldn't keep me warm. There was no magic fix for this. She was terrified. And she was crying, she wanted to get off the ride. I became the parental figure. I held her hand and I said, there's just 2 more. It'll be okay, nothing can hurt us. We're just going to get splashed. She held my hand and she put her head down onto my shoulder. And she toughed it out, but it was a traumatic time for her. One of my earliest memories of my dad was watching him go on a ride at a theme park also. It It was called the Octopus Ride. The Octopus Ride was pretty intense. It lifted you maybe 30 feet in the air in little carriages, and then it would start spinning you around faster and faster. I remember watching my dad and realising that he had his eyes closed. He had his eyes closed and his hands together, as if he was in prayer. My older siblings told me that when he got off, he'd been reciting the Lord's Prayer. You know the one? Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. That ride must have destroyed him, to get to the point where he actually felt the only thing that he could do was go into some kind of prayer state to get himself through it. I remember my dad's cars. My dad had a conveyor belt of shitty, broken cars. They'd last for around 6 weeks and they'd usually break down in front of our friends on the way to school. Smoke had come out of them, the lights had stopped working. Sometimes we'd have to jump it to get it going. And this is in the playground or on our street where the whole public could see us. It was like having a big sign over us that said, "Our dad's got shitty cars and he don't give a fuck. Why can't we just have a car that works like normal people?" I don't see anybody else having to help their dad start the car by pushing it down the street. I don't see the engine falling out of other people's cars at traffic lights in the middle of town. I remember the embarrassment of Mum's bright, flowery hippie dresses, her pendants and beads and rings. She never looked like anybody else's mum. She always looked like a hippie from the 70s, but she didn't care. The older I get, the embarrassment becomes mine, for me, not for her. It was kind of cool that she had that style. She knew who she was, she knew what she liked, and she wore it without giving a fuck. My dad hid his broken heart from me, not just about the divorce and leaving his kids. He was unlucky in life. Both of his parents, my grandparents, died suddenly of heart attacks before I ever got to know them. I can't imagine how painful that must have been for him, just to get a phone call to say, "Your dad's dead, your mum's dead." My last day at school was the end of the summer term, and it turned out to be my last day ever at school. There was going to be an end of term performance where I was going to sing a song on my own, but I was adamant that my dad was not allowed to see it. I didn't want him to be there because I would find it embarrassing, and also I wouldn't be able to sing properly because I knew he'd be in the crowd. I sang the song by Simon and Garfunkel, Bright Eyes. You know the one. So, just as I'm coming to the middle bit, I see my dad's spectacles just poking over the back of the very back person. He managed to sneak in, and he was watching me, and he thought that I couldn't see him. At the time I felt really angry and grumpy with him, but it took me years to realise just how much he loved me for him to have done that. He couldn't resist seeing his son sing at school. I remember my mum's attention to my emotions. My mum always made it okay for me to talk about how I was feeling, and for feelings not to be these strange imposters in my life. She made it clear that it was alright to feel scared, to question things. I remember crying my eyes out all evening when I was 9 or 10 years old, because I was going through the contemplation of death and that things have an ending. I remember asking if there was a God and what happens when you die, and she really calmly just sat with me and let me be emotional about it. She told me that she didn't know, she didn't have the answers. And to be honest, by the end of that evening spent crying with her, I realised that all of the questions were nowhere near as important as having her there to help me ask them.